Courage Under Fire wasn't just another 90s war drama. It was the film that challenged the Pentagon so aggressively they walked away and it still refused to compromise. When audiences sat down in theaters on July 12, 1996, they had no idea they were watching a movie the U.S. Department of Defense had actively tried to kill. They didn't know about the internal cover-ups, the deleted scenes, the Australian tanks disguised as Abrams tanks, or the early psychological breakdown of a young Matt Damon who nearly destroyed his body for a 2-day role. What you're about to discover is the shocking story behind Edward Zwick's forgotten masterpiece, a film that rewrote the rules of how Hollywood portrays military authority, female combat heroism, and the devastating cost of institutional lies. These are 20 facts about Courage Under Fire that even dedicated fans don't know. Let's go. Fact 20. The Pentagon rejected it before they even filmed a single scene. The Pentagon's rejection of Courage Under Fire wasn't a footnote. It was a declaration of war. What audiences don't realize is that producer Stratton Leopold submitted the first draft to the Department of Defense in March 1995, initiating a brutal 6-month period of script negotiations. The Pentagon didn't just suggest changes, they demanded them. An 8-page Points of Concern memo arrived, detailing every single element they found threatening. They wanted less mutiny. They wanted the accidental shooting clarified as non-intentional. They demanded the helicopter type be changed from medical to logistical. They even insisted on removing any references to Gulf War syndrome, a condition that would haunt veterans for decades. By October 1995, just before principal photography began, the DoD issued their final answer. No. The Pentagon's entertainment liaison, Philip M. Strubb, made it personal. He looked at the script and declared bluntly that there wasn't a good soldier among them. It wasn't a professional assessment. It was contempt. The filmmakers, led by director Edward Zwick, refused to soften their story. They chose truth over access. That choice echoed throughout the entire production. Fact 19. They had to use fake British tanks disguised as American Abrams. Without Pentagon support, Courage Under Fire faced an equipment crisis that forced production to get creative and desperate. The film needed M1 Abrams tanks, real ones, but the Department of Defense wasn't lending anything, so the production team did something radical. They sourced former Australian Army Centurion tanks and spent resources on elaborate modifications to make them resemble M1 Abrams for on-camera use. Think about that. The military apparatus refused to cooperate so aggressively that Hollywood's solution was to disguise British-manufactured Cold War-era tanks as modern American armor. The problem? It showed. Military experts and tank enthusiasts have pointed out that the tank tactics in the opening friendly fire sequence are virtually implausible. The M1A1 Abrams formations are hub-to-hub, something you'd never see in actual doctrine. The disguised Centurions couldn't move like real Abrams tanks would. The suspension was wrong. The profile was wrong. This technical compromise remains one of the film's most noticeable flaws, a permanent scar from the Pentagon's refusal to participate. Fact 18. Meg Ryan underwent brutal physical training to play a combat pilot. Meg Ryan didn't just show up to play Captain Karen Walden. The actress, known for romantic comedies and dramatic roles, committed to a rigorous military preparation regimen that transformed her physicality for the role. She trained with military consultants, learned helicopter terminology, practiced weapons handling, and embedded herself in the world of medevac operations. What's remarkable is that Ryan's casting itself was a risky move in 1996. Female action heroes were exceptions, not rules. She was stepping into a role where she'd be required to portray multiple versions of the same character, through flashbacks, each one painted differently by unreliable witnesses. The Rashomon structure meant Ryan had to embody a brave leader, a coward, a strategic thinker, and a selfless soldier, often within the same scene, depending on whose perspective audiences were experiencing. Her physical preparation wasn't just about authenticity. It was about earning the right to tell this particular story. Fact 17. Matt Damon lost 40 pounds for just 2 days of filming. This is where production tragedy intersects with commitment, bordering on self-destruction. Matt Damon, an unknown actor at the time, made a conscious decision to undergo severe physical transformation for his role as Specialist Ilario. The actor put himself on a strict regimen of food deprivation and physical training. He lost approximately 40 pounds. His health became so compromised that medical supervision was required for several months after the shoot ended. Damon was on set for barely 2 days. 2 days of shooting. Yet he submitted his body to a months-long ordeal of starvation and exhaustion to inhabit those handful of scenes. What makes this even more devastating is that the role went largely unnoticed by critics and audiences. Damon felt so overlooked despite his method acting sacrifice that he later contemplated suicide. He was struggling with depression and feeling invisible in an industry that had just rejected his contribution. That emotional darkness lasted until he met with Steven Spielberg, who had actually seen Courage Under Fire and was so impressed that he promised to cast Damon in Saving Private Ryan, but only if he was at his normal weight. It took a later success to heal the psychological wounds from this early sacrifice. Fact 16. Denzel Washington was nominated for an Oscar, sort of. Denzel Washington's performance as Lieutenant Colonel Nathaniel Serling earned him a nomination for Best Actor at the 1996 Chicago Film Critics Association Awards. His portrayal of a man dissolving under the weight of guilt, institutional pressure, and alcoholism was universally praised. Roger Ebert called him riveting. Peter Travers of Rolling Stone wrote that Washington's haunted eyes and the film's cinematography had created something profound. Yet Washington lost the nomination to Billy Bob Thornton in Sling Blade. What audiences didn't realize was that this performance, which captured the emotional devastation of PTSD and moral compromise, would become Washington's own personal watershed, a role he's spoken about years later as among his most challenging because it required him to essentially drug himself on the emotional level, accessing trauma that many actors refuse to touch. Fact 15. The film was the first major Hollywood production about the Gulf War. This is a remarkable historical fact that often gets overlooked. Courage Under Fire wasn't just another war movie. It was the first major Hollywood studio film to take a serious, critical look at the 1991 Persian Gulf War. The war ended in February 1991, and by 1996, it was still so culturally raw that no studio wanted to engage with it honestly. Instead, Hollywood made action thrillers like True Lies and Executive Decision that deployed Islamophobic narratives and avoided the actual complexity of Desert Storm. Courage Under Fire was a deliberate decision to confront what everyone else was ignoring. The timing mattered. The film arrived 5 years after the war ended, when enough distance existed to ask difficult questions, but the wounds were still fresh enough to matter. No other major Hollywood production had dared approach the Gulf War with this level of nuance, emotional intelligence, and institutional critique. That bravery probably cost the film commercially, but it earned it a place in cinema history. Fact 14. Scenes about fear and emotional vulnerability were deleted after Pentagon complaints. What's truly astonishing is that the Pentagon's influence persisted even after they withdrew support. Director Edward Zwick and screenwriter Patrick Sheen Duncan had written a crucial scene where two combat veterans, Ilario and Serling, admit that fear is a fundamental emotional force bonding them together. This wasn't weakness, it was psychological truth. But Pentagon memos responded to this specific scene with condemnation. The memo argued that enduring and overcoming adversity bonds people together, not fear. The Pentagon's perspective was that acknowledging fear would make the military look vulnerable. So, the scene was cut. Not because the filmmakers wanted to compromise, but because the emotional weight of that particular truth was too dangerous for institutional comfort. The replaced dialogue about delivering a letter to Walden's parents was more symbolic and less psychologically honest. This deletion removed the entire thematic underpinning of fear from the narrative, even though the military refused to support the film. That's how deep institutional control runs even in films the Pentagon officially abandoned. Fact 13. The film was nominated for multiple technical awards, despite critical dismissal. What makes Courage Under Fire's critical reception fascinating is that while it received positive reviews overall, it was almost completely shut out of major awards consideration. This wasn't because the film was flawed, it was because the establishment both in Hollywood and the Pentagon rejected what it was saying. The Academy didn't nominate it. The Golden Globes barely acknowledged it. Yet cinematographer Roger Deakins created images of such stunning clarity and emotional power that they should have dominated technical categories. The production design, the sound work, the editing, everything was executed at the highest level. In 2025, The Hollywood Reporter retroactively recognized Courage Under Fire as having the best stunts of 1996. That's a film that was punished for its content being recognized decades later for the extraordinary technical achievement everyone tried to ignore. Fact 12. Fox 2000 Pictures made this their flagship debut feature. This was the first film produced by Fox 2000 Pictures, a division founded in 1994. That means Courage Under Fire carried the weight of launching an entire studio's theatrical ambitions. The film had a budget of $46 million, enormous for the time. Denzel Washington's salary alone consumed $10 million of that. This wasn't a modest project. This was a major studio bet on a politically challenging war drama. The production needed to succeed not just artistically, but commercially, to justify Fox 2000's existence. The film opened in 1,986 theaters and earned $12.5 million in its opening weekend, placing second behind the dominant Independence Day blockbuster. That opening weekend performance was respectable, but not dominant. However, the film had legs. It grossed $59 million domestically and $41.8 million internationally, for a worldwide total of $100.9 million. That meant roughly 2.2 times the production budget was recouped moderate success that kept Fox 2000 viable, but didn't transform it into a powerhouse. For a war drama in the summer of 1996, That was actually respectable performance, yet it has been largely forgotten. Fact 11. Patrick Sheen Duncan's script was inspired by real Gulf War incidents. The screenplay didn't emerge from pure imagination. Screenwriter Patrick Sheen Duncan began research in July 1994 with a trip to Fort Hood, one of the largest active-duty U.S. Army installations in the world. Duncan interviewed soldiers, listened to their accounts, and studied the complexities of what actually happened during nighttime combat operations in the Gulf War. The friendly fire incident that frames the entire narrative was inspired by real incidents where American troops accidentally fired on other American troops, a phenomenon that happened multiple times during Desert Storm, and was systematically covered up by the military. The character of Captain Karen Walden wasn't directly based on one person, but her story echoed the experiences of women serving in combat zones whose contributions were often minimized or reframed by institutional narratives. Duncan's research became a debt that drove every script revision. When the Pentagon demanded changes, Duncan and the producers had to ask themselves, are we making a politically safe film, or are we making a true one? They chose truth. Fact 10. Richard Gere was originally slated for the Denzel Washington role. Before Denzel Washington became synonymous with Lieutenant Colonel Nathaniel Serling, the role was being considered for Richard Gere. Yes, an officer and a gentleman's Richard Gere. Imagine that performance Gere's particular brand of intensity and charisma. The project underwent several casting iterations before Zwick and producers settled on Washington, fresh off the success of films like Crimson Tide and The Pelican Brief. Washington brought a gravitas and emotional depth that Gere's approach might not have achieved. This wasn't a knock on Gere, but Washington's ability to convey the dissolution of a man under psychological pressure was precisely what the role demanded. Zwick had directed Washington to an Oscar in glory. He knew what Washington was capable of at the deepest level. That creative partnership proved essential. Fact 9. The film's structure intentionally mirrors Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon. This wasn't accidental filmmaking. Director Edward Zwick and screenwriter Patrick Sheen Duncan deliberately constructed Courage Under Fire as a modern echo of Akira Kurosawa's 1950 masterpiece Rashomon, which presented 4 wildly different testimonies about a single event. In Courage Under Fire, 4 witnesses, Ilario the medic, Monfries the gunner, Altemeyer the wounded soldier, and Serling the investigating officer, all recount the same incident in the desert. Each account contradicts the others. Each character reveals different aspects of Karen Walden's character and leadership. The film doesn't give audiences one definitive Walden. It gives them several, forcing viewers to assemble truth from fragments of conflicting testimony. This structure is devastatingly effective because it mirrors how we actually experience traumatic events in reality. We rarely have access to objective truth. We have perspectives, stories, contradictions. By structuring their film this way, Zwick and Duncan elevated what could have been a procedural drama into a philosophical meditation on the impossibility of absolute truth in war. Fact 8. Sean Astin's small role came during his transition to major roles. Sean Astin appears in Courage Under Fire, in a small role that showcases the film's commitment to casting depth. The film arrived during a period when Astin was transitioning from television work toward becoming a major film star. Within months, Astin would appear in films like Courage Under Fire, that would establish him as a reliable, dramatic actor. His presence in the ensemble cast demonstrates how this production attracted serious talent, even for minor parts. Filmmakers knew that Astin brought credibility and commitment to every scene, no matter how small. That attention to casting depth, where even minor roles get treated as opportunities to hire talented actors, elevated the entire ensemble's performance level. Fact 7. Scott Glenn's character was designed to represent the Washington Post's investigation of friendly fire incidents. Scott Glenn plays Washington Post reporter Tony Gartner, and his character wasn't invented for dramatic purposes. He represents the actual investigative journalism that was occurring in real newspapers. Journalists were asking real questions about friendly fire incidents in the Gulf War. Glenn's character embodies that institutional accountability function the press as the counterweight to military secrecy. By casting an actor of Glenn's stature in this role, the film positioned journalism as morally equivalent to military investigation. The screenplay argues that journalists and soldiers can both pursue truth, but often from different motivations. Glenn's performance as a dogged, persistent reporter mirrored the actual work happening in newsrooms in 1996, as journalists uncovered details about the Gulf War that the military wanted suppressed. Fact 6. The production refused to make female combat service look heroic and unrealistic. What's remarkable about how Courage Under Fire treats female combat service is its refusal to make it mythological. The film doesn't argue that women make better soldiers. It argues that women are soldiers. Meg Ryan's Karen Walden isn't portrayed as superhuman. She's wounded. She makes difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. She bleeds. She dies. The film's greatest strength is arguing that female soldiers deserve the same complicated, morally ambiguous treatment as male soldiers, not some elevated, sanitized version of heroism. This was genuinely radical for 1996, when most war films treated women in combat as either invincible icons or tragic victims. Courage Under Fire refused both narratives. It said, women are soldiers. They experience the same trauma. They make the same mistakes. They deserve the same institutional accountability. Fact 5. Multiple script drafts existed with substantially different endings. The screenplay went through numerous iterations with the Pentagon and between producers and Zwick. Each draft shifted the ending's emotional weight and political implications. Earlier versions contained more explicit institutional critique. Later drafts softened some language while maintaining thematic integrity. The final film found a balance where Serling's personal redemption and professional accountability remained central, but without becoming propaganda for either military vindication or anti-military sentiment. This evolution wasn't compromise, it was refinement. The filmmakers tested which version of their story was most emotionally true to the characters while maintaining intellectual honesty about institutional power and moral responsibility. Fact 4. Roger Deakins' cinematography was rejected by Pentagon officials for being too honest. Roger Deakins, the cinematographer who would become one of cinema's greatest visual artists, composed images that the Pentagon found threatening. Deakins' camera work plunges into the mad flare of combat, as critics noted. His cinematography doesn't glorify warfare, it documents it. The visual language is harsh, unforgiving, and psychologically overwhelming. The Pentagon understood that visual storytelling carries emotional weight that dialogue can't manipulate. A sobering image of combat's chaos is propaganda against war, not for it. Deacon's commitment to visual honesty meant the film looked like what combat actually feels like, not what the Pentagon wanted audiences to believe about military service. That visual authenticity contributed to the DoD's rejection of the project. They recognized that cinematography, this powerful, couldn't be controlled or reframed through official statements. Fact 3. The film's budget consumed $16.7 on Denzel Washington's salary alone. Out of a $46 million budget, Denzel Washington's salary was $10 million. That's not just a star's premium. That's an indication of how much faith the studio had in Washington as the film's emotional anchor. No other actor on the set came close to that compensation level. This financial commitment reflected the studio's understanding that Washington's gravitas, his ability to convey psychological dissolution, and his star power were essential to the project's viability. Fox 2000 was betting its launch on Washington's ability to carry a politically contentious war drama. Washington's performance justified that investment entirely. He became the film's conscience, its emotional core, the character through which audiences experience the conflict between personal morality and institutional pressure. Fact 2. Monfrais's suicide by train scene was a shocking narrative choice for 1996 cinema. When Lou Diamond Phillips's character Monfrais forces Denzel Washington's Serling out of a car at gunpoint and then deliberately drives into an oncoming train, it's a moment of stunning narrative brutality. The suicide isn't depicted as noble sacrifice. It's depicted as the consequence of institutional cruelty, moral compromise, and the psychological devastation of combat trauma. In 1996, Hollywood rarely showed military personnel committing suicide as a direct result of institutional cover-ups and moral failure. This scene transgresses against the narrative comfort that war movies typically provide. The sequence is visually spectacular in its destructiveness, a collision of human despair and physical force that audiences still find difficult to witness. It's a refusal to let viewers escape the emotional weight of complicity. You can't watch Courage Under Fire and feel comfortable about the institutions protecting themselves at human cost. Fact 1. The film's ending reflects real gaps between institutional truth and human truth. In the final moments, Serling experiences a revelation. He sees in a flashback that Karen Walden was the medevac pilot who lifted off with his friend Boilar's body on the night of his friendly fire incident. He's been drawn to her case not because of institutional procedure, but because of unprocessed grief. That revelation allows him to finally release the feelings he's developed for her. The ending isn't triumphant. It's melancholic. Serling returns to his family, having done his duty recommending Walden for the Medal of Honor, but having permanently altered his relationship with institutional authority. He resigns his Pentagon position. He publicly confronts the suppression of his own friendly fire incident. The film argues that sometimes the greatest courage isn't action, it's accountability. It's the decision to tell the truth, even when silence is easier. This ending refuses the closure that war movies typically provide. It argues that some truths live in the gap between official narratives and what we know in our hearts. Bonus fact. But here's the one thing that ties everything together. The detail that explains why Courage Under Fire matters so much more than most films from 1996. The Pentagon's rejection of the film happened on May 21, 1996, just months before release. By that point, production was essentially complete. But the timing meant something specific. The DoD had time to influence cultural attitudes about the film. They could signal to major institutions that this was a film the military didn't support. That institutional distancing likely affected awards consideration, critical discourse, and how the public received the narrative. The Pentagon couldn't stop the film from existing. What they did instead was deny it the cultural validation that Oscar nominations and establishment critical acclaim could have provided. This wasn't censorship in the governmental sense. It was institutional pressure applied through the withdrawal of access, through commentary on the characters, through negative messaging to the industry. The film was released, reviewed positively, and promptly forgotten by major institutions. That's how institutional power actually works in Hollywood. Not through direct suppression, but through the withdrawal of support and the strategic deployment of skepticism. The legacy of Courage Under Fire isn't in awards or box office. It's in the fundamental shift of how we talk about military service, female soldiers, institutional accountability, and the cost of war. This is a film that changed cinema by refusing to compromise, by demanding truth, even when the Pentagon said no. If you made it this far, you know that Courage Under Fire deserves to be rediscovered. It's a masterpiece of its moment, imperfect, ambitious, and absolutely fearless. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below on what shocked you most about this film's production. What hidden fact about Courage Under Fire did you not know before? Let me know in the comments. And hit that notification bell because we're diving into more forgotten 90s films that changed cinema forever. This is the real story behind Courage Under Fire.